This is the...
Sitter pappa för det. Hey, Papa. You can grab these things. They are right outside. You can get some. Det är gott.
Tjabba.
Här är sant.
Absolut bra. Hela familjebilden.
I'm going to steal this back.
Okay.
So you don't be calling it uncomfortable. No, I will. You can just... Just on how are you? Hey. I put myself
I'll go again.
Okay, hello. We're all cramped into this wonderful exhibition. This is the last weekend of this exhibition. Is this the first time anybody's seeing the show? Yes. A couple of people, good, well. There'll be a moment, there'll be a chance when we all leave in an hour to have a look. But we are enormously delighted to have Fredrik Hellberg and Lara Lesmes of Space Popular come back to see their exhibition in its final moments. And to sort of, this is basically represents the kind of, the end of what has been 8 weeks of conversations, of provocations, all based around the theme of this show. And we're going to begin by Lara and Fredrik giving a brief rundown of what the hell we're looking at in Boxen right now. And we're also super delighted to have Mark Wigley, Dean Emeritus of Columbia University's School of Architecture, Preservation and Planning. And also, crucially, I think, a really significant voice in thinking about questions around architecture. And I just wanted to say, this book, which Mark and Beatriz Colomina, who is sat here as well, co-wrote to coincide with the 2016 Istanbul Design Biennial, which they created. And I believe that you will be in Stockholm next week to present this at Konstfack. It's a very, very important, but it'll be recorded, I'm sure. And it's online anyway. Let's not all go to Konstfack in case it's a private event, but no, I think it's appropriate. It's a really important book which exists in libraries all around Stockholm, and it's going to be out of print soon, I'm pretty sure. So do grab it. So that's a book plug, and the idea of this event is to be sort of informal, to talk about a topic which has been very, very central to this project, which is the question of storytelling in architecture, of narrative in architecture, broadly of kind of communication in architecture, because architects, I would argue, don't build, right? Architects communicate ways to build. Architects use writing, use drawing techniques, use modeling to basically tell stories. And if an architect cannot tell stories, cannot construct narratives about their work, then they're possibly failing. I don't know if that's a provocation. People are looking shocked and surprised. But if you do feel shocked and surprised by anything that happens, feel free to be part of it. We're in this kind of piazza space inside the exhibition because this is a conversation. And of course, we'll begin a little bit formally with some more discussion. But let's open it up. If you want to jump in. That's the point. This event is being live streamed. And it's recorded, so if you don't want to live on forever on the internet, then keep silent and forever hold your peace. But with that, let's begin maybe with you, Lara and Fredrik, just explaining a little bit about what we're in, what the show is about, and maybe touch upon this idea of narrative in the exhibition.
Yeah, sure. Great, thanks for the intro. And what the place we are at and what this exhibition is trying to do is precisely to deal with the a potential future where architects might be practicing in the virtual world. So you will see depicted 6 quite recognizable environments of Stockholm. Some of them particular places like Stureplan or Östermalm's murals in the metro station. Others that are more Stockholm typologies, like the Stockholm home, according to how we see it. And over each of these environments, we have created a narrative and overlaid what we imagine could soon be augmented information, an augmented layer of visual narrative that will be on top of them. And each of them follows a slightly different theme.
And we just bring you up to speed on this kind of prediction, humble prediction on the future in which we will all live very soon, when these bulky pieces of furniture we strap over our faces now to see something virtual to something like this very soon. So it's very, very much a kind of call to action, not just to architects, designers and city planners, to begin questioning what will the city be like when we all experience it on an individual level, and we might carry our own narrative that we don't share with the other people that we share the same sidewalk with. And the kind of core question that the exhibition brings up is this idea of value, and the fact that we value architecture based on a few set parameters that are based on physical properties. So how big something is, what it's built of, where it is. So if a building is on an expensive address, the value goes up. And this, of course, in many ways, when we talk about this kind of technology, changes radically when size and scale and these kind of other properties don't apply anymore. So if we go back to some of the examples, we look at a wall made of gold, for instance, something that's materially very valuable. And in fact, in a computer-generated visualization, gold is one of the cheapest materials to make.
Computationally speaking, in terms of you need a lot less calculation to generate a gold wall than to generate a dirt wall, because dirt has a lot more detail, has a lot of more variation, a lot more complexity.
So actually dust is the most expensive thing in computer-generated terms. So all of these properties are completely shifted, and they are compartmentalized into things like this now, but really when they are no more locked into this thing, everything will kind of change. And also on top of this, we would like to just kind of share our view on what this technology is a trajectory of, let's say, and when we use the word virtual, what do we actually mean? And in our practice, we very much see that this technology is not, it doesn't exist in isolation, it's a continuation where previous examples we might refer to is television, photography, innovation in painting, and so on and so on and so on. Basically, the power of humans to represent something that is not there. And if we look at architecture, we have some examples here, for instance, the Gilded Hall depicting narratives of national pride and national kind of innovation. And then with this kind of new technology, this can change by the minute. So we can see, we can just point out some examples where perhaps things we should celebrate instead of some king killing a dragon, Candy Crush, for instance, or Wikipedia, or the invention of the internet, or Minecraft, things that perhaps are more relevant to our times.
Yeah. And then in places like Stureplan, where now we find shops of a certain kind, perhaps it becomes a public virtual place, virtual marketplace, where you can go and buy the new skin for your avatar, or you can enter a shop where you can buy whatever gadgets you want to wear or embellish yourself with.
And then there are some core questions that it brings up as well in relationship to how we use the city today and when it's overlaid by virtual information. So any virtual information that you see in the city today are locked to a LED screen or to a sign or to a poster. It will have to be similar in this prediction of the future, where, because we're walking through the city with our bodies still, which means that people that we meet on the street, they will have to be represented in all of our individual narrative worlds. So they will need to find new skins similar then to buildings. So for instance, again, this mural originally done by Siri Derkit in Östermalms Torg's tube station, carrying political messages, can extend a little bit from its confinement, but it needs to be locked to the physicality so that you don't walk into things quite directly.
So maybe as a bit of a closing statement, linking back to what James started with, that architects tell a story rather than build a building, and then eventually a building is built through lots of management and all things. When we look at virtual worlds and when you step into the virtual world that is available through the headset, you are stepping into a world that we are telling, but that also that we have directly created. So that relationship also changes, where the transfer from creator to visitor to guest is immediately direct.
Absolutely. And before we just launch into this discussion, it's important to mention that one of the first starting points for this exhibition was actually a piece of literature. It was a book written by Stanley Weinbaum in 1935 called Pygmalion Spectacles. And this is nothing new necessarily. We know that this idea of the virtual is not new. Of the idea of virtual reality, that's one of the core arguments that Fredrik was explaining about. The Sistine Chapel ceiling is essentially, you could argue, a virtual piece of architecture. But in Pygmalion Spectacles in 1935, set in Manhattan, there is a kind of presentation put forward of the idea of entering other worlds, constructed worlds, through, in a very prophetic description, the idea of glasses or a VR headset. So very specifically in this book is described a pair of spectacles in which you place what they describe as liquid positive, a kind of liquid that you pour into the spectacles, which then constructs the world. Now, I don't know if you've read this. It's a very short book. It's worth reading. I'm not going to spoil the ending, but of course the book ends in a kind of interesting way where it starts to dismantle these questions between reality and perception. But one of the main arguments that comes up in this book is this idea of human perception. When the protagonist is in Manhattan and talking about looking at a series, almost like a wall of buildings across Central Park, he says, how do you know that you are actually looking at these buildings, or how do you know that you're actually looking at a perception of light? And one of the big questions that was raised early on in this process, as you see in this exhibition, is a statement which basically says the first thing to transfer between a physical architecture and a virtual architecture is surface. And that's why we have these two-dimensional surfaces suspended on this scaffolding structure. Because inside a virtual environment, you're dealing with, I think, something that you beautifully described as light and color, right? That's the sort of the building materials of virtual spaces. So in many ways, that's the underpinning concept. Everything is somehow rooted, or the idea of virtual reality is rooted in literature. Literature has been one of the most prophetic ways of understanding where we are now and where we're potentially going. But to maybe bring back to this sort of idea of communication, Mark, do you even fundamentally agree with that as a statement?
Oh yeah, I agree. But I think also, I mean, because this is a very crazy group of people. There's a lot of people here.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we could put you all on the couch and say, "What are you doing here?" It's a Saturday, right? So you're not working. Then you leave the city to go to this island. So that's not a real place, but a kind of fantasy place. And then you go to a museum, which is not in the world either. It's kind of cut off from the world. And then you choose between art and architecture and design, and you come here, and then you go inside this box, and then you go inside this box to this thing. So you've done everything you can to disconnect yourself from everyday life. like the last thing you might find here is reality. You know? Although you came to architecture and design, and that's interesting. Maybe you thought that, because if you go to art, of course, you think, of course, that the artist is not going to show you a tree like you see a tree outside. It's going to show you an idea about a tree, right? So if somebody did a painting of a tree which was exactly the same as the tree outside, why did you come inside to see it? You expect the artist to make you see your world differently, through new eyes, maybe forever to see trees differently. And so when you go towards art, you imagine that that's what you're doing. You imagine that art is all about ideas about the world, not about the world, and even ideas about what's possible in the world or what's not possible. I mean, questions. You expect questions. when you go towards architecture and design, there's a little bit the feeling that you go towards answers. You know, if you ask for somebody to design you a nice coffee pot, you would like coffee to come out of the coffee pot, not an idea about a possible coffee. So maybe you are crazy people because you're leaving the real world behind, but then at the last minute you came towards the real world, to architecture and design, and look what you got. See, I mean, actually, at least if you went towards art, you would have found some trees. You know? So here, and what's worse is that the architects are telling you this is kind of like the real world. Like the real world is now virtual. So just to say that this decision to come into a museum is maybe one way to understand what James was saying. Maybe give you another example. When you go to a cinema, of course nobody goes to the cinema anymore, but let's say you remember the cinema, you know? It's like a very big TV. And a TV is like a very big computer, which is like a very big cell phone. So actually we do it all now with the cell phone. But let's start with the cinema. You go inside the space, there's a kind of architecture of the space, but the whole architecture of the cinema must disappear during the film. The seat must be so comfortable that you are not aware of your body. The lights go down so you don't see the architecture, so that you go into the image. So we have this idea that when you go into a story, you leave the real world behind, and that you leave architecture behind. You have to leave architecture behind and disappear into that story. Which means when you go to a cinema, you don't really want to be in the room. You know, if it's a movie about the desert, you would like to be in the desert. So everything they are saying about the virtual, this is also true of cinema, which means that you actually know perfectly what they're talking about, right? It's this moment where you are in the world, but you, through a particular medium, you decide to leave the world behind and enter a story. Could be documentary, could be fantasy. You have to make this decision. You are never super sure. You know also that stories sometimes become real, and also you know sometimes that stories are more real than real. That somebody makes a poem about the World War might be finally more realistic than a black and white photograph of the situation, right? So imagine that architects are people who think that buildings are a medium. So they think that you could tell stories with architecture. So instead of turning the lights out, they say, no, let's look. And architects think that buildings are telling stories. And therefore the architect, she's a storyteller, right? She makes a building that tells a story. So actually architects are not good at keeping you dry and warm and safe, right? They are not good for that. Right? So if you really would like to be protected by architecture, never talk to an architect. You talk to an engineer or a construction person. An architect is somebody who thinks that a building is full of mystery, that architecture is like an art, that architecture, like any other medium, can communicate the highest aspirations and dreams of society. I could say it worse to you. An architect is simply somebody who doesn't know what a building is. Right? Everybody else knows. Right? Like a toilet. You all know what a toilet is and you use it, no problem. Right? For the architect, the toilet is a kind of comment on technology and society and so on. Right? So the architect is like a child. Right? All children think that buildings are haunted and alive. Then as adults, we are trained to think that no, architecture is not haunted. But you know that Hollywood makes billions of dollars because you secretly still believe that architecture is haunted, because in a movie you only need about 5 seconds of silence and already people are because you just know that there's some creature in the closet. So the architect is thinking that buildings can talk, something that you believed as a child, then you were told is not true, and then they recover that. So this is a long-winded way of saying I super agree with James. That architects are storytellers, and quite romantic stories. Like architects are actually amazingly optimists, and there's very little reason, as your T-shirt demonstrates, there is extremely little reason to be optimistic today. But architects think that with very small changes of the built environment is possibly the idea of a new society, right? Not the new society arriving, but just the thought of it, or the thought of being more kind to other people that we share the planet with, or more kind to animals and resources and so on. These thoughts, if we would hesitate for a moment, maybe this is what the architect is trying to do, make you hesitate in everyday life, think a little bit, reflect, and if you reflect, maybe you think differently, and if you think differently, maybe you see differently, and maybe if we see differently, we share the world differently, and maybe ultimately we live in a different world. So this is let's say the long story. And this is a very long answer to your question, but let's just go to ancient Greece, right? If you want to say, like, are these the cool cats, right? Doing something new, virtually.
No, yeah.
Right? So let's go to the least cool thing possible. Classical architecture, Greece, right? What is the main argument that architects made? They made that the Greek temple is beautiful. Why is it beautiful? Because the columns have the same proportions as the invisible harmonic resonances of the universe. So if you visit a Greek temple, the temple is in the world, like for example on the Acropolis, the Parthenon, but it's not just in the world, it's actually picking up signals, vibrating with signals coming from the universe. So actually it's a kind of a spaceship. A Greek temple is not sitting on the ground, not built up like this. It's a spaceship that has landed. That's why it has a kind of a platform. And when you rise the steps, when you're in that space, you're in that world but not in that world. Something that most people feel when they're in a religious space, that they are in the world but not in the world. So this is a totally virtual argument. Now if you're an ancient Greek, you say, hey, it's not virtual, the universe is full of these vibrations, right? And these guys are doing something very, very similar. So the first thing to say is that this is super interesting work, super radical work, but it's just also, let's say, the traditional work of an architect. And just to finish the long speech, not only you don't go to the cinema anymore, you make the movies now. Like, we don't watch stories made by other people. We are in an age in which you make your own stories. You generate everything. We live our lives as one continuous selfie operation. So what becomes, I think, super interesting is when architects who think that buildings talk, that think that the environment talks and want to tell interesting stories, how do they adjust their stories in an age in which everybody is able to edit their identities, their avatars, their bodies, their face, that you can redesign your face, you can redesign your children if you just need a little bit of money, actually a lot of money, but you can do it. It will become, we live in this moment where everyday life is much more radical than the fantasies of most of 20th century art, for example. So there's a really a kind of a curious moment whether architects are willing to embrace how strange everyday life is. You know, like just think of the selfie, that we have decided that no longer do we take pictures of the world, but we take pictures of ourselves in the world, right? The selfie places you in the world. Why? Because we are not so sure anymore what it means to be one person in one place. None of us are one person anymore in one place, right? It's a very strange moment. So selfies somehow almost say, I exist, I exist, but I don't exist simply in Stockholm, I exist in all of these different platforms and so on. So this is an extremely interesting moment when architects are talking to a community that probably in their everyday life is more radical in what they're willing to do, what they're necessarily doing, than what architects do. And I think this is the sort of exciting moment. It's not that what these guys are doing is so hardcore. What people are doing every day is kind of hardcore. I think almost I think of this installation as a kind of documentary in that sense. And that's why it's sitting in a museum, because it's a respectable place, respectable curators. You know, we live in a very, very strange moment. And for me, it's exciting that you will make a gallery in which architects are invited to experiment with that, you know, strange reality. So this is a long way of saying yes. I agree with you.
Excellent. I have about 20 mental notes. I don't know. The one thing which let's pick out first is something that you mentioned semi-briefly, comparatively to the rest of the others, which is this idea, if we connect back to perception, is that you go to a cinema, and the whole point of a cinema, as you said, is the furniture, the design, the space should disappear.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah.
And maybe as a sort of counterpoint to your argument, and something that I know that we really discussed, is that architecture on the whole is designed to be backgrounded. It's designed to be invisible. A door is a certain height so we can walk under it, right?
Yeah.
And not have to duck and not have
Yeah.
to. And the question maybe and maybe you can respond to this, that you're raising here is we're at a point where this idea of architecture as background, excluding the idea of the temple or the sacred space or places which are specifically designed to focus attention,
Right.
is changing. Like the creation of kind of like, or the proposition or the assumption that these artworks, that these murals ask you to make, is that we are entering into a moment where augmentation becomes more visceral.
Yeah, I think that's, like Mark, you just said, like, yeah, we go to the cinema, we want everything to disappear, and as you turn the lights off. But then you went on to saying that now we watch movies with the lights on,
Yeah.
and we even make the movies with the lights on. Everything is there. Everything is more of an overlay. You
Yeah.
don't switch from one to go to the other. And I think it's very interesting that you spoke about the selfie and you placing yourself in that environment. You place yourself in the set.
Right.
And that is what highlights even more the general understanding of architecture as a set that you want to be part of, that you want to see yourself in. You almost ascribe to that idea,
Right.
that narrative that place is providing, and that it doesn't need to be. I mean, it's as simple as a home with a particular style in its decoration, and then you see yourself in there, and somehow, I don't think, and people usually see it as a superficial thing, but I think it's a really good thing. What that environment is doing is it's making you somehow creative, is allowing you to maybe change the way you do things, to do them in the way that environment inspires. And what we think and discuss a lot is that perhaps we are not trained so much as architects to really work with that. We are, some of us, better trained than others to deal with issues of construction and so on, not if you studied where we did. But we are not trained so well in the sense of like, how do you signal things, how do you provide these narratives, how do you provide experience of spaces. And it seems more and more that will be the way in which we will be practicing. So why can't we talk about that? Why can't we have a value-based conversation on like, that is a good set and that is a bad set? Not because I like that one and not this one, no, because that one really transports me and that one is not doing that so well, or because this one is too overwhelming and I cannot have my whatever chess game because it's too overpowering. Do we have this vocabulary and even this criteria?
I love what you're saying. I mean, one possible, it occurred to me while you were talking that I mean, I would want to say that, for example, science fiction, it's huge in the 20th century. It's the dominant mode of architectural discourse.
Yeah.
All of the main periods of architectural thinking, of modern architecture in the 20s, when Le Corbusier presented his sort of city plan, critics called it architecture for the moon. Right? Buckminster Fuller finishes his 1930 book, his first book, with a whole science fiction chapter. There is this it's just continually there. But my theory would be something like architects are always telling stories, but the history of architectural theory is the history of when we admit that we're telling stories and then we pretend that we are not. And then we admit that we are. So, for example, postmodernism is when everybody said, and they would all super agree with you, like, it's all about the story, it's all about the narrative, architecture is a stage set for the narrative. Then there's a return of kind of computation and all that. Say, no, it's about science and about calculation.
Yeah.
Archigram and so on, they were all about science fiction and NASA and all of that. And then in the 70s, rationalism and basically said it's not a story. So basically, architects are actually have a lot of anxiety about what it means to tell stories. So they tell the story that they're telling stories, and then they tell the story that they're not telling stories, and then they tell the story. You know, we are really uncertain, and it's really stupid. Think, for example, of a medieval cathedral. Firstly, I mean, some of you might be super religious, so would be best to leave the room at this point.
We're in Sweden.
But if, for example, a religious group super believes everything in the religion, right, they really do, then you don't need a cathedral, right? Part of the purpose of the cathedral is not only to express the confidence in the sort of theory, but also to reassure everybody that there is one. And that whole thing of singing together and doing rituals together is to sort of say, well, I believe and you believe that we believe, because we wouldn't say I believe if we really believe, right? So every religion uses architecture to sort of, in a way, reinforce the doubt that there is. And look at the medieval cathedral. It's media. It's like these unbelievable stained glass windows which tell these narratives. Actually, the interesting thing is the stained glass windows are so high that you can't read the narratives. You need an expert to say to you what the narrative is. So it's a very complicated thing. So you with a medieval cathedral, maybe it takes 100 years to build it. It requires all the craftspeople and all of the money and all the resources of a society. And the tower is as high as possible to express this kind of confidence, which is not there. But it's a media device, so that when I enter that space, I enter a space of imagination, of religion, of faith, and of community, and all of these things. So for architects to a certain point say, no, it's not really about fantasies, it's about technology, and it's about the truth, and it's about proportion, and all these things. It's just sort of an idiot move on the part of architects. And I think one of the reasons the education is so weak is that we just haven't sustained faith. And I think it's crazy because nobody likes architects.
No, yeah.
You know, nobody does. I mean, they're nice people. I mean, and they look human, right? I mean, architect. It's only when an architect starts talking that you realize they're not human. Until then, they look, you know. Because architects say a building is not just a building is a story. And everybody's going like, oh, you know, this is going to cost me 3 million euro. I'm not sure. So we have a lot of anxiety about the storytelling idea. We think there's a sort of responsibility to the background, responsibility to infrastructure, to technology, all these kinds of things, which interfere a lot with what you're saying. And I think this is why we don't tell ourselves the truth about our field. Deep down, architects think that architecture is the most fragile thing there is, the most delicate, the most, you know, and I think you capture quite well this fragility, you know, which is the opposite of what the architect is supposed to be. The architect's supposed to say, ta-da, here is this thing that will be still there, it's going to cost you a huge amount of money, and it's still going to be there, you know, 25 years from now.
Yeah. I mean, this fragility of the discipline, though, is like absolutely crucial, because like no one actually needs an architect. I mean, this is sort of the fact of the matter that architects are not required. The skills are not crucial to building shelters,
right?
Like that. And for time immemorial, architects have not been needed, and they are not needed. And at this particular moment, like based on the kind of assumption of Fredrik and Lara's idea or future vision of urban environments, and there is absolutely no requirement for architects or designers or artists to be involved in the creation of virtual environments or augmented virtual environments.
Oh, yeah.
But who's going to create all the content?
Anybody. I
But
mean, the point is maybe that obviously the content has to be created, but there's nothing right now, and the scale of excitement in the architectural community about engaging with the kind of softwares that you use is minimal. And at this point in which one of the arguments that we've been making is
They're still crying now. You just made the redundancy.
Or at the absolute vanguard. Yeah. Because I mean, this is the point. Is one of the underlying points is that this headset, right, as you explained, is going to be out of date. It's out of date already. Next year, there's going to be another version in which the sensors that we see here, the computer that's inside here, will be within the device, and it will become cheap and it will become accessible. And we're at this kind of crux, this kind of threshold by which virtual reality, augmented reality also, is about to become widely accessible to us all, and therefore maybe then it's too late for us to seriously, for architects to actually start to seriously engage in the way that I think you do.
And this is where maybe things are not changing completely, but just intensifying.
Precisely, yeah.
So I think it's very interesting to go back to points you make in the great book of yours about innovation in paint making modernism possible,
Yeah.
and the kind of illusion that modernism was somehow a new chapter that didn't
Right.
need stories, but of course it was completely based on stories in the same
Yeah.
way, but just
Yeah.
they're manifested in very different media. All of a sudden, the whole thing is the story, but all the bits needs to be there to tell the story. And then this is maybe where the kind of arguments become a bit loose, because there's very few kind of stepping stones here. But the introduction of television then as well maybe then kind of collapses the things that happen on walls of cathedrals
Right.
into, and it can be somehow personalized. You can change it. You have some kind of moments to change it. And of course, with phones and sort of increase in this combination between that technology and the spaces we're in, when they're collapsed and become more and more personal, and then what we're speculating in here, that literally architectural elements becomes the icons or the emoticons, then that this mirror that you kind of speak about, technology and questions of who we are, becomes so immediate that like you can ask a question and you get a response almost immediately. Whereas architecture previously, you needed 100 years to build a mirror
Right.
to then reflect yourself in. So I guess an interesting question is the phone or this kind of thing different enough to kind of become more than a mirror?
Well, I mean, as a referee here, because if you follow what James is saying, there's sort of two outcomes, right? Two possible outcomes. One is you're unemployed because we don't need you anymore because everybody's an architect now and everybody's able to create their own digital platforms and to reskin themselves, and they're doing so probably at a speed in which architects can't handle, and so on and so on. That's one argument. Another argument would be, in your defense, maybe, is if the role of the architect is to ask questions, it's a little bit what I was saying before, then the issue becomes what are the kinds of questions that can be asked in digital environments that are not necessarily being asked by the people that are doing them all the time. If you think of, for example, that all the discussion about fake news, which is clearly playing such a huge role in organizing contemporary life, and as the tragedy of the United States in this moment, which becomes, of course, a world tragedy, you could replace the word fake news with virtual. Right? Fake news is simply the construction of virtual realities, and then what we are all afraid of now is that we don't have the way to distinguish between those realities and what we believe to be the reality. And we used to say, and how do we point to what we think to be the reality? Well, we used to point to certain media, newspapers and so on, as the kind of reference point, but that required enormous trust on our part. We just over the years built up a certain trust in that. Now what's happened is that our life is organized much more according to these virtual environments, and maybe, for example, the idea of democracy is a virtual idea, is a dream. It's a belief. It's a fantastic ambition. It's as Obama used to say, a very fragile, ongoing experiment. I think that's a great way to say it. So if that's the case, then the role of the architect might be the classical role of asking questions, and particularly the agility and sophistication with which you are thinking about this would enable you to, as it were, in a certain sense, interrupt the way that virtual environments are being constructed on an everyday basis. So I see you caught between trying to educate the rest of architects that there is this world that they need to get ready for. And then there's a second question is, now that we're educated, and imagine that you had 100 more colleagues, equally snappy and fast, and also rivals that you felt like you had to be more interesting than, then certain strategies might develop for how architects can operate in the virtual environment. And in the virtual environment, they would be exactly as you said, as sort of unneeded. But who needs painters? Who needs writers? Who ever needed anybody? I suppose we have the idea that we need lawyers, right? Lawyers and dentists, and so in a certain sense, the unnecessary group becomes very, very important. And surely we have to add the fact that most of us are becoming unnecessary because of robotics. I mean, imagine also a world in which almost everybody's labor is unnecessary from the point of view of efficiency. In other words, what in a moment in which more and more of society is dedicated to playing or thinking, more and more like architects. I think there's a kind of a space there to think about. Anyway, I'm just going on and on, but I think I totally agree with James's kind of challenge. Like, well, are we out of work now? I mean, already in the 50s, Constant Nieuwenhuis was imagining a world beyond labor, New Babylon, in which we would all just play all the time, and we would all be our own architects. So you could say at that point architecture was out. It's a really good question.
But I think all this is relying on a certain confusion that I think there usually is, in the sense that our purpose here of all of us is to find shelter and protect ourselves and be efficient and survive. Like shelter and survival. Whereas it's far beyond that. I mean, we are all of us, most of our lives are based on the making of unnecessary things for shelter and survival. Life could be a lot simpler if that was our task.
Yeah.
And then based on that, I mean, there is we base it all in a certain exchange, so we inspire each other to do things differently, right? And to get to other places. And then I wanted to touch on this idea that everyone creates their own content, which I don't think it is. That's how it happens. I mean, everyone exchanges content, but you don't create your own content. I mean, when the 3D printers arrived and people thought like, everyone will have one in their own home and you can make your own toys. No one is making their own toys for a reason. This is not happening. You exchange someone, you are making certain things and someone else is making other things and you exchange them, and that's how, because we behave more like an anthill than we behave as separate individuals, I would say. Yeah. So if we base it on that, then that exchange is what I think one would tap into. It's a long way to find myself not redundant.
No, I see you. It's a very good. You're working a very good loophole. By the way, if we were more like ants, we would be more intelligent, right? Because the ant colony is kind of an incredibly. You ask an ant what's it doing.
It doesn't
and
know.
it has no idea, right? But the ant colony,
But that's exactly the same.
And
what are you doing? I don't know.
Yeah.
I know that we are all doing something so important. But
so the exchange, the sort of endless exchange, because like, for example, most selfies are selfies trying to look like other selfies, right? There's only certain kinds of ways of taking a selfie, and most people have perfected the art.
Yeah.
So it's exactly it's an incredibly important insight that you're making, that we're mainly exchanging. But if you think of exchange as the most creative mechanism, as a kind of collaborative sharing, like we have this idea of the designer, like it all must come from the brilliant person. Actually, the interesting stuff comes from these more viral kind of exchanges.
And this maybe goes back to I think the notion of the reference. That's, you were talking about Greek temples, and Greek temples were motifs and are based on outer space, and then how that makes them into a spaceship, and they also come from immediate nature. The leaves and the tree trunks, and so you start building up a slightly new world, but very highly referential to what you had then most of, which was nature. And then that somehow starts evolving, and we're always like basing on reference and reference. So I think also the acceptance that there's this idea of the architect, of the designer, someone that comes up with something original, it's a flaw. Like if you are fully embracing the fact that you are building upon and just distorting a little bit existing things, then you're accepting that. I mean that's the reason why all of this is just full of references. We could have tried to start from scratch, and then maybe we would have portrayed a virtual world that looks like everything is black and there is some neon blue lights, and then that would be referencing Tron. But there is always like people attack us usually when like you're creating virtual stuff, and why do we have marble? Why do we have stone? Why do we have curtains and mosaics? Because that is our starting point, and that makes our experience of the virtual world much more important. And I think all this connects to the fact that everything else is built upon.
People say that to you? They do? Like, why is it?
People think that it should look like nothing I have ever seen before, and I say, well, like you do that.
Mm.
I don't know
But isn't that like an idiot comment?
But it's very common that like people just.
But if it wasn't
that
virtual, you know, like for example, it was not something that from the non-virtual world, why would you call it virtual? In other words, it's an idiot comment. What makes
I don't understand.
but I mean, what makes it virtual is that it is something lifted out, lifted and made virtual. If for example, there was some kind of materiality that was sort of fundamental to computational space, like some sort of magic stuff, then that wouldn't be virtual. That would be the reality. That would be the reality of that space. So in other words, you exactly. I mean, I love your clothes, right? See, and I think your clothes are like one of your, like all architects. You know, architects are a desperate species.
Yeah.
You could spot an architect from like 50 meters away. But they're wearing their ideas, right? They're like philosophy. And I just wanted to point out, like the Greek temple was much more colorful than your outfits.
Yeah.
Right? It was like really bright purples and so on. And this brilliant guy, Gottfried Semper, in the 19th century, when they were digging up all these old temples and statues, they discovered that they were all covered with paint. And of course, the German art historian said, like, no. That's just not really there. It's this white marble, because white marble is like pure. It has all these great ideas. And Semper led the way in saying, no. It's not just that the white marble was covered with paint. And he said, by the way, the only reason they use great marble was it's very good for painting on, which is like a super insult. You know? And he said the real architecture is in the paint, and the architecture begins with fabrics, with fashion, with clothing, with textiles, with color and smell. And he would say things like, a woman's hairdresser knows much more about architecture than any architect, because it's much more complicated, right? You know, right? Much more complicated than making an architecture. So again, getting back to the medium thing, what he was saying was architecture is only as thick as the paint of the layer of paint. And so in a way, I don't see the work that you're doing here, for example, as like just like surfaces, or it's not media simply because it's the surface. Architecture is a surface medium. It's kind of like a clothing. Another way to ask the question is kind of, what are we going to be wearing? And as a result of these technologies, what are we going to be wearing? Like, how are we going to wear our spaces, and how do we wear it together? I mean, that's the interesting thing. But you know, classical architecture was sort of pornographic. Like it was seen to be sort of obscene, the colors, and there was a lot of denial. Even today, I think even I am telling you the story, and even I am like suppressing the thought. It was like this lurid, kind of almost fluorescent, and we want to say no. The ancient Greeks were not like pornographic like that, which is ridiculous. You know, if you think about sex in the ancient Greek time, it's much wilder than today. Much wilder. A lot more drinking, a lot more craziness going on. You know, so why wouldn't we get with the program? We just could be. To summarize, it might not be that we are. The problem today might not be that we're just not very sophisticated about our relationship to media. We might just be boring. It's possible that we're just a boring generation. The cell phone is doing much more, and this is one of the things that Beatrice and I were arguing in the Are We Human? The cell phone is doing all the things that architects said that they were doing: shelter, communication, information. It's all there in the phone. People are, if you really want like the function of architecture, it's in the phone. And therefore everybody should be more like you, dressing a bit more. I mean, look at architects, line them up. Boring. Really boring.
But like this is what's interesting about that. And when you talk about this idea of transaction, like, isn't it not, and this idea of surfaces, medium, and this you know, bandstand of people who look all the same. I think it's the question of mimicking is maybe a more, you know, if we're thinking about languages, because mimicking is not copying, right? Copying is kind of like a thoughtless thing. Mimicking, there's a process of thought that takes place. And when you talk about referential architecture, it's to some it's copying, but in this case it's mimicking. It's redrawing, it's restructuring. And I mean, maybe that's sort of the root of it. No? I mean, maybe it's just a linguistic thing. Because I find referential, or the idea of referential, a little bit problematic. But the idea of mimicking, when you talk about the selfie, when you talk about fashion is just mimicking, though. It's just trend.
Right.
And you mimic and you shift and you take that a little bit, but essentially it's things move.
Yeah, but you see, just trend, that's a bit tough.
Yeah, that's tough.
It's a bit tough, just trend. I mean, fashion goes to our anxieties, right? I suppose, right? That in order to be yourself, you have to change your clothes because everything's changing. So you kind of have to. So everybody's adjusting their look in order to position themselves in society.
Yeah,
like with, if you're of a certain age, you can spot whether a T-shirt is the right. Let's say you want to say that you don't care about fashion. Right? A lot of people, it's very important to say I'm not part of fashion. Now, how do you say that without accidentally getting caught into a fashion? You have to adjust yourself to wear just the right kind of T-shirt that's shaped a little bit but not too shaped. If I get a Uniqlo T-shirt, is it already a little bit too, precise? So it's about sort of micromanagement of aesthetic narratives, mainly coming from kind of anxiety, like, do I exist? Am I exist? I think if we would say that architecture was based on anxiety, it was all about anxiety, we would get a lot further. I mean, I give you really a strong example. In most religions, when somebody dies, there is this, like a piece of stone. Right? Not all religions, and that's weird, right? Because the one thing you cannot understand is the death of somebody you love. There is no 10 steps to nirvana or whatever. It's just impossible to understand and impossibly painful. How do we deal with that pain? We put a stone with the name of the person in a place. Like we try to make an object that never moves with the name on it. So we actually mark our greatest anxiety with an object. And what if cities are just like the same? Like everything that you see that's so confident is so strong because actually there's a lot of anxiety there. Like remember when banks used to look like so big and strong because they were really afraid. Why afraid? Because there's never any money there. The way capitalism works is, I mean, if all the money was in the banks, capitalism fails, right? Yeah. The whole trick of it is to say I have the money, but it's a lie. So what if the strongest, most confident statements in architecture, like the strongest, most confident statements in our clothes, come from actually sort of anxiety? Then actually these stories that you're telling, it's not like let me just tell you a story, kids. It's like, what kind of narrative could we tell that allows us to sort of adjust to the total weirdness of life? I mean, I don't know about you guys, but when I look in the mirror in the morning, I don't know what that is. I'm very familiar with it. It's the same thing. I've seen the same, and I come to understand that it's me, but it's not, it's like, have you ever listened to your own voice after it's been recorded? That is horrible, right? Either you speak like an idiot your whole life, or somebody hijacked your voice, right? Those are the only two options. So actually the weirdest thing in life is yourself, right? Nothing stranger. So if humanity really doesn't even know what it means, again the are we human thing, then architecture is part of the way in which we build a narrative that allows us to deal with this kind of strange relationship we have to each other and to the world and to animals and so on. I love people today that are writing about, for example, relationship between humans and their pets. Like this there's a very, very beautiful book by Donna Haraway, I think, and the opening of the book is when she reaches out and touches her dog, exactly what is happening there. Because the dog is so much part of her that she's not reaching out, and I think these kinds of questions are the questions in which architects could enter in. Especially now that our species is about to destroy the planet. It's a good moment to check out what the hell is this human thing, right?
Absolutely. Anybody want to
join in
on that note?
We start with world peace.
Well, I was thinking of another point that came up now as you were making this argument with the idea that we make graves or a representation of the self so that it still exists somehow. And the fact that most of these things we create to represent ideas or to deal with the anxiety of existence are mostly visual, which is another point that I wanted to touch on, that we also get asked a lot about why the extreme focus on one of the senses and not the others. I mean, you were mentioning as well that architecture is smell and possibly all the touch and all the other senses, but we're somehow trying to become more comfortable with the idea that it is mostly visual, and through the visual you tap into all other senses. And if it's to a certain degree mimicking, or then you fill up the gaps. Like, I know how this wall feels, even if it has never physically existed. I know I can almost touch it through the combination of what I see and what I have experienced before. So I was thinking of how the different, if there would be a discipline for each of the senses, how would they, that they need to evolve together.
So,
As we create new virtual visual worlds, we need of the other ones to come together to close in the gaps, or
So, three things, right? Is it like announcing the next airplane departure?
Yes.
Yeah. Gate 24.
It's the tour, I think.
In Spanish, right? Just in case you think you're still in Stockholm. You know, when I was saying to you before, you go in, and when you might imagine you came in here and you came out in Madrid. I mean, that'd be architecture, right? A few quick thoughts, like just really random, because you're asking a question I think is super important. First would be, I mean, I don't know the research that well, but there's a lot of writing about why the visual dominates and is particularly contemporary. It's a relatively recent history, right? That vision dominates in the way. So there is strong research on that. The second point I would make is, but we too easily think of the visual as visual. Like actually the visual is very complicated. The visual is about vibrations and wavelengths. If you think about vision as vibration, then it doesn't sound so superficial. So if somebody says to you, as your lawyer, like if somebody says to you, hey, you guys are just visual, you know, you should say, you mean we deal with vibrations, right? Visual means that you're dealing with vibrations in a certain wavelength, right? So you could say, yeah, we specialize on these frequencies, but it's not simply, and that's technically true, right? And it's not like we just have using that as a medium. We totally could understand, and maybe one day we'll work in other frequencies. So the next thing I want to say is, but see, you made a carpet. And I think that for me the most beautiful thing of this show is the carpet on which we are sitting, and it's playing really the classical role of a carpet. It's creating a social space. This is again, Semper says, architecture begins with the carpet. And you don't have to sit on it. You can just look at it. He said, if you hang a carpet, he said the free architecture begins at a festival when you hang a carpet on the side of a hill and people gather around it and have a party. So that it creates a space. It's not a space of 3D. Space of a carpet is a sensuous space, a space of language. It says, it's a language of communication. So actually, for me, the strongest part of your show is the carpet. I mentally keep thinking to myself, if I take away these ones, does it get better or worse? And for me, a little bit, I imagine it as it's kind of a magic carpet, and different possible vertical images could come up. So I see these as sort of extrusions. I know it's not quite true, given your plan, but I think this gesture, anybody that says to you that your work is simply visual is an idiot. I think you could tell them that.
Yeah.
Say Mark Wigley said so.
So two things. I would say that this is a carpet, right? And in the most obvious sense, you could feel the softness when we walked in. And it's also very beautiful the way the image is. Also, you have a very particular visual style. If visual is your thing, there's a sort of a softening inside all the image, but it's very clear in the carpet. I think you can, after a while, just see these as carpets, right? So these are just, and you see you have the scaffolding. Semper said that the physical building is just a scaffolding for the layers of paint, right? So this is a totally important argument that you live in the sensuous surface of the vibrations, the smells, and so on of these surfaces, and architecture is just a scaffolding. And that idea was very, very influential in the 20th century. I mean, he's a mid-19th century guy, but it's very, very influential. But we don't like to talk about it. It's a bit like architects saying we just make fabrics. And the final point is, this is the tricky one. So I warned you before you should leave. Yes, architects work a lot with the visual, but another way to think about it is, if architects are working a lot with what you can see, they are also taking a lot of things away from what you can see. And mainly what architects do is censor, is hide things. Like in this space, for example, you don't feel any wires. Right? You just don't feel like this. You know, lights appear magically. Everything is done here so that you are floating in these surfaces, these white surfaces in the carpet. This is not more of a carpet than the walls, but we are floating here like in a spaceship together. Because none of us want to know the truth of all the plumbing and ducts. You know, if for example there's a toilet over there and the sewage pipe is over there, the shit is going under this floor. Right? By the way, if you dig here, you're going to find shit at some point. Right? You will. You might pass electricity along the way, and you know, you're going to find a lot of. None of us want to know about that. Right? No, it's like it never happened. Most people that go to the toilet, it's like nothing happened. People come out from the toilet with a look on their face like absolutely nothing just happened, and you're supposed to look at your friends with that. Yes, I'm going to pretend that nothing just happened, just like you're pretending. So we don't want to know. So most of architecture is about taking things away from your vision. So one more move on the people who say you're just visual, you're idiots. You know, architects are really in the business of visual censorship, blind spots.
Yeah.
Right? So I really think that's a big issue. Repression is the main work of the architect because we're afraid.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm afraid, and most of us are pretty scared. Like, by the way, what makes you think that this floor is not going to collapse during this event? Like, what makes you think that this many people can sit on this floor? Because you think that very, very boring people did the calculations. Right? If I told you that every decision for this floor was made by an architect, right? So you really don't know. You really don't know what this floor is made of. You don't know what it's like to be in this room, and you don't want to know. I don't know either. We live most of our lives like in an airplane. I finished with this story.
I love this one, yeah.
Oh, he knows it. You can tell it.
No, but I mean, it's so true. Is the idea when you
we
go
pretend that we've told you something.
I mean, I'm going to tell it super badly, but you know, when you go into an, you have to interrupt me if I say it. You go into an airplane, it's like returning to some kind of primordial state, no? Because you give over all of your trust to 3 pilots that you've never met and you will never meet, going at 500 miles an hour across the sky, sat in a comfortable seat with stewards around you who are there to care for you and protect you.
Like a baby.
Like a baby. And the only decision you have to make is chicken or beef, unless you ordered a vegetarian meal.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's so true. It's like the most primal state you can return to now, today.
And none of you believe in flight, right? None of you really think that a metal cigarette should lift off, right? So you can deal with that different ways. Alcohol is a standard technique, drugs of different kinds. You can just not get on the plane, like a lot of people just don't fly. You can be the whole flight sure that you're going to die. Right? You can see that by the knuckles, and you can hear it when the plane lands and everybody's applauding. The applause says we didn't die, right? And some people on the plane are saying, I'm going to die next time. So the main thing is nevertheless you do it, right? You're up there, and everybody's working hard to make you comfortable with the fact that you don't believe in the situation you're in. It's no different to be in this building, right? You don't really know. You believe that the museum will offer you certain, reassurances, and that you're suspended within that. And we aren't really flying. In a museum, you want to fly. You want to leave your expectations behind and listen to the sound of architects, in this case crazy architects, and think differently. And so then architecture's role is to sort of help kind of reassure you that you could, in your anxious state, just sort of dream a little bit. Right? So it's not even an architect saying, here's the story. It's almost like, you said before, not even simply background, it's more like creating. And this is what a carpet is, hospitality. I think nothing more important in life than hospitality, right? To admit, to welcome in the person you don't know who may say something different. And if architecture was only making carpets, it'd be much better than it is today. And that's what you guys are doing. I think it's great.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you. We're going to leave it there. We're going to stick around for a little bit.
Thanks for your questions.
Yeah, thank you for your questions. And I mean, thank you. Pick up one of these if you haven't got one already. There's some there and some outside.
And take both the book and the map, because this has the 10 Commandments.
Oh yeah.
Future.
For a future virtual architecture, which interesting ends in this idea of the self. So thank you so much for coming. The next exhibition, this closes tomorrow. The next exhibition will be peppercoxes. So from one extreme to the other, make a gingerbread house, compete. See you again soon. Thank you.